The ordinary boy who wasn't so ordinary you close your eyes and imagine an ordinary boy growing up in suburban America. A quiet neighborhood, houses neatly lined along the street, children riding bicycles in the evening sun, and families gathered around dinner tables. On the surface, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer seemed like just another boy in this setting. He was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, was a homemaker. To the outside world, the Dahmer household looked normal, maybe even privileged. But behind those closed doors, small cracks began to form that no one could see at the time. Cracks that would eventually split wide open, spilling horrors the world still struggles to comprehend. As a toddler, Jeffrey was shy and withdrawn. He wasn't the kind of child who laughed loudly or ran up to strangers with open arms. Instead, he often sat quietly, lost in his own little world. His parents later recalled moments when he seemed unusually detached, almost as if something invisible separated him from everyone else. Some neighbors thought he was simply shy, maybe just a bit of a loner. But early signs were already brewing, hidden under the surface of that quiet, boyish face. By the time Jeffrey was 4, his family moved to Ohio because of his father's work. It was during these years that strange habits began to emerge. Dahmer showed an unusual fascination with dead animals. While most children might cry at the sight of a lifeless bird or run away from a road-killed raccoon, Jeffrey would stop, stare, and examine. He began collecting bones, fascinated by the way they fit together like puzzles. To him, there was something beautiful and intriguing about the skeletons of creatures once alive. To anyone else, it was a red flag waving silently in the wind. But the red flags didn't stop there. His parents' marriage was unraveling, and the household was filled with frequent arguments. Joyce struggled with mental health issues and addiction to prescription medication, while Lionel was often absent, buried in his research work. For a boy like Jeffrey, already withdrawn and isolated, this environment only deepened his loneliness. He had very few friends. Classmates later remembered him as awkward, sometimes making bizarre jokes about cutting up animals. At the time, people laughed it off, dismissing it as weird humor. No one imagined these words were windows into a dark and twisted imagination. By his early teens, Dahmer's fascination grew darker. He began drinking alcohol excessively, sneaking beer and hard liquor even during school hours. Teachers noticed him coming to class smelling of alcohol, yet they chalked it up to teenage rebellion. Inside, however, Jeffrey was drowning in his own thoughts, using alcohol to silence urges and fantasies that were beginning to consume him. He confessed years later that by the age of 14, he was already imagining controlling people completely, making them stay with him forever even if it meant robbing them of life. When Dahmer turned 18, those fantasies crossed the line into action. The year was 1978, and his parents' marriage finally collapsed. His mother took his younger brother and moved away, while Jeffrey was left alone with his father in the family home. That summer, Jeffrey had just graduated high school. He seemed lost, unsure of his future, drifting aimlessly. But behind his lost expression was a storm gathering strength. One June evening, Dahmer spotted a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks walking along the road. Hicks was cheerful, friendly, and looking for a ride to a rock concert. Dahmer pulled up, offered him a ride, and casually invited him back to his house for a few beers before heading to the show. Hicks accepted after all. Jeffrey looked harmless, just another awkward young man trying to make a friend. At first, everything seemed normal. They drank, chatted, and played music. But as the night wore on, Hicks grew restless, eager to leave for the concert. For Jeffrey, panic set in. He didn't want Hicks to go. He couldn't bear the thought of being abandoned again. Those dark fantasies of control surged forward, louder than ever. Grabbing a dumbbell from the basement, Jeffrey struck Hicks from behind, knocking him unconscious, and then strangled him to death. For the first time, Dahmer had crossed into the darkness, and instead of regret, he felt something else, a twisted sense of power, of finally making someone stay with him forever. But now came the problem of disposal. Panic mixed with his fascination for bones and anatomy. He stripped the body, dissected it, and buried the remains in the backyard. Later, he would dig them up, crush the bones with a sledgehammer, and scatter them in the woods behind his home. No one suspected a thing. Hicks simply vanished, and Dahmer returned to his quiet, awkward existence as if nothing had happened. This was only the beginning. What makes this first murder so chilling is not only the brutality, but also the calmness that followed. Dahmer continued with his life, briefly attending college, then enlisting in the army. He was discharged after heavy drinking made him unfit to serve. Still, no one connected him to Hicks' disappearance. He was invisible in plain sight, an ordinary young man carrying an extraordinary darkness inside. The years that followed would see a pause, but not a permanent one. Like a predator lying low, Dahmer's urges simmered quietly, waiting for the next chance. And when that chance came, it would unleash horrors far beyond what anyone could imagine. Because Jeffrey Dahmer was no ordinary criminal. He was becoming a monster, one who blended into society so well that for over a decade, his neighbors, his friends, and even the police failed to see the truth staring them in the face. Imagine, for a moment, a storm held back behind thick clouds. You don't hear the thunder yet, but the air feels heavy, charged, and waiting to explode. That's what Jeffrey Dahmer's life looked like after the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978, to the outside world. He was simply a lost young man drifting without direction. But inside, the storm of obsession and darkness was only gathering strength. After high school, Dahmer's father hoped discipline might straighten his troubled son. He enrolled Jeffrey in Ohio State University, but college life didn't last long. His alcoholism spiraled out of control. Instead of attending classes, he spent nights drinking heavily, alone in his dorm room. Within months, he dropped out. His father, desperate and frustrated, decided the military might provide the discipline Jeffrey needed. And so, in late 1978, Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army as a combat medic. At first, it seemed like a chance for him to reset his life. Military life was structured, demanding, and it forced him to focus. But soon, alcohol took over once again. He drank on duty, broke rules, and was often caught intoxicated. The discipline that had been meant to save him only revealed how deep his addictions ran. Stationed in Germany, Dahmer's behavior unsettled fellow soldiers. Some later reported that he had drugged and assaulted them, dark foreshadowings of the control he would later exert over his victims in America. But at the time, those complaints didn't go far. After just 2 years of service, Dahmer was deemed unsuitable and discharged in 1981, quietly. The army sent him home, unaware that they had just released a ticking time bomb back into the world. Back in Ohio, Dahmer's drinking grew worse. With no job, no school, and no stability, he spiraled further into loneliness. His father, seeing Jeffrey's life collapsing, forced him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Perhaps, Lionel thought, the steady influence of a kind, religious grandmother might help Jeffrey regain control. And, for a while, it seemed to work. Living with his grandmother, Dahmer appeared polite and respectful. He accompanied her to church, did chores, and followed her house rules. Neighbors described him as quiet, sometimes even helpful. But under that mask of normalcy, his fantasies were boiling again. He still longed for total control-keeping companions who could never leave him. In 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure. 2 years later, he was arrested again for disorderly conduct. The incidents seemed minor at the time, but they revealed cracks in the mask he wore for society. His grandmother noticed odd things too strange, smells coming from the basement, late-night activity, and his obsession with bringing young men home. When she confronted him, Jeffrey offered vague excuses. He blamed taxidermy experiments or spoiled meat. She wanted to believe him, so she did. But the truth was far more sinister. By 1987, Dahmer's urges could no longer be contained. 9 long years had passed since the murder of Stephen Hicks. The storm was ready to break again. That year, Dahmer checked into a hotel room in Milwaukee with a man named Stephen Twomey, according to Dahmer. He didn't even plan to kill him. They drank heavily, and Dahmer later claimed that when he woke up, Twomey was dead beside him, beaten severely. Jeffrey said he had no memory of the killing. But whether he remembered or not, what he did next was deliberate. Instead of calling for help, Dahmer bought a large suitcase, stuffed Twomey's body inside, and transported it back to his grandmother's house. There, in the basement, he dismembered the body and attempted to dissolve the remains in acid. For the first time, he experimented with keeping certain body parts, bones, organs, even skulls. The fantasy of having a permanent companion, someone who could never leave him, was becoming reality. This murder unlocked something in Dahmer. The silence of the past 9 years was shattered, and his compulsions returned with a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied. Over the next 2 years, Dahmer would lure men to his grandmother's house, often from gay bars in Milwaukee. He promised drinks, companionship, or small amounts of money. Once they trusted him, he drugged them, strangled them, and carried out his gruesome rituals. At first, his grandmother occasionally noticed young men entering the house late at night. She asked questions, worried about Jeffrey's lifestyle. But she never suspected the true horror happening beneath her roof. When strange smells drifted upstairs, Dahmer blamed it on a plumbing issue or the chemicals he used for cleaning. Again, she believed him. Jeffrey Dahmer, the polite grandson, seemed incapable of real harm, but harm was all he was causing. He kept experimenting, preserving skulls, collecting bones, and trying to create what he later described as zombies. He believed that if he could drill holes in his victims' skulls and inject chemicals, he might keep them alive but fully under his control. The thought terrified most, but to Dahmer it was the perfect solution to his loneliness. If they became zombies, they could never leave. By 1989, his crimes were escalating, but still he remained invisible. That year, he was actually arrested for sexual assault after luring a 13-year-old boy. He served a short jail sentence and was released early. Unbelievably, the justice system let him go, failing to see the predator he was becoming. And so, the storm gathered even more force. Jeffrey Dahmer was learning how to refine his methods, how to hide his crimes, and how to charm his way out of suspicion. What had started with a single hitchhiker in 1978 was now transforming into one of the most disturbing killing sprees. America would ever know, because Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just killing. He was creating a private world, hidden in apartments and basements, where life and death, control and destruction all belonged to him. By 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer the troubled young man hiding in his grandmother's basement. He was something far darker, a predator who had learned to mask his urges behind a soft-spoken smile and polite demeanor. When he moved into his own apartment in Milwaukee, Unit 213 of the Oxford Apartments, the stage was set for one of the most terrifying chapters in American true crime history. Imagine walking down a dimly lit hallway. You pass ordinary doors, families behind some, students behind others. And then there's Unit 213. The air outside smells strange, like a mix of chemicals and rot. Neighbors whisper about the odd man who lives there, quiet, but always carrying heavy bags of garbage out at night. What they don't know is that behind that locked door lies an apartment filled with nightmare skulls, bones, body parts preserved in jars, and photographs of mutilated victims. It was a place where Jeffrey Dahmer created his own twisted kingdom. In this apartment, Dahmer perfected his methods. He prowled Milwaukee's gay bars, offering men drinks, companionship, or small amounts of money to come home with him. Once inside, the cycle repeated itself: drug them, strangle them, and then carry out his dark rituals. But this time, he wasn't just killing, he was experimenting. Dahmer craved control. He wanted companions who could never leave, so he attempted horrifying experiments. He drilled holes into his victims' skulls and injected acid or boiling water, hoping to create what he called zombies, victims who could live in a twilight state alive but stripped of free will. The attempts failed, leaving behind only more death. But to Dahmer, these experiments were his desperate way of silencing the loneliness that consumed him. At the same time, Dahmer's desire for trophies grew stronger. He kept skulls, skeletons, and even entire organs preserved in his apartment. The freezer contained human flesh. Drawers held photographs of his victims' bodies in different stages of dismemberment. To outsiders, he looked like a quiet man working at a chocolate factory. But his home was a macabre museum of his crimes. Neighbors began to notice. The smell of decay seeped through the walls. One woman, Glenda Cleveland, lived in the building and often complained about the strange odors and the constant sounds of power tools. Dahmer excused it as spoiled meat or exotic pets. Incredibly, many accepted his explanations. After all, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't look like a monster. He was soft-spoken, polite, almost shy. And that was his camouflage. One of the most chilling moments came in 1991, when a young boy named Konorak Synthesophone actually escaped Dahmer's apartment. Naked, drugged, and bleeding, he was found by neighbors who immediately called the police. When officers arrived, Dahmer calmly told them that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, and that they had simply had a domestic dispute. Despite the neighbors' protests and the boy's obvious distress, the police believed Dahmer. They returned the boy to his custody. Hours later, Konorak was dead. This single failure of the system showed how close Dahmer came to being stopped and how his charm and the biases of the time allowed him to continue killing. For Dahmer, it was proof that he could outsmart anyone, even the police. His confidence grew, and so did his brutality. By now, Dahmer's apartment had become a prison of horrors. Acid barrels sat in the corner, used to dissolve bodies. The refrigerator contained body parts. The walls were decorated with Polaroids of his victims. And deep inside his mind, Dahmer dreamed of creating something even more grotesque, a shrine. He wanted to build an altar made of skulls, candles, and bones. A place where he could sit surrounded by his trophies and feel powerful, even divine. But as the murders piled up, the chaos inside Dahmer's life grew harder to control. He missed work, drank excessively, and became reckless. His neighbors noticed the smell growing worse, the noises more frequent. Complaints stacked up, but no one suspected the full truth. On July 22, 1991, everything finally came to an end. That night, Dahmer approached 3 men and offered them $100 to come back to his apartment for drinks and photographs. One of them, Tracy Edwards, agreed. Once inside, Edwards immediately felt uneasy. Dahmer handcuffed him and pulled out a knife. Terrified, Edwards tried to stay calm, looking for a way to escape. For hours, he talked to Dahmer, trying to convince him not to kill. Finally, when Dahmer's attention slipped, Edwards punched him and ran out the door. Half-dressed and still in handcuffs, Edwards flagged down 2 police officers on the street. He led them back to Dahmer's apartment. What they found inside shocked even the most seasoned detectives. Opening the refrigerator, they discovered a human head. In drawers and cabinets, they found photographs of mutilated bodies. Barrels of acid filled with decomposing remains stood in the corner. Skulls were lined up like trophies. The apartment of horrors had finally been exposed. After years of killing, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign was over. As news of his arrest spread, the world reacted with disbelief. How could someone so quiet, so ordinary, commit such unspeakable crimes? Neighbors who had seen him daily, police who had spoken to him, co-workers who chatted with him all realized they had been living next to a monster hiding in plain sight. But while his capture ended the killings, it also opened a darker question. How had Jeffrey Dahmer been allowed to operate for so long? How had so many warning signs been ignored? The answers would unravel in the trial to come. The moment Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in July of 1991, the thin mask he had worn for years crumbled. Sitting in the Milwaukee police station, he didn't try to deny his crimes. Instead, he spoke with a chilling calm, as if finally unburdening himself from secrets too heavy to carry. For hours, then days, he poured out a confession so detailed and horrifying that even hardened detectives were shaken. Dahmer admitted to killing 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. He described, in methodical detail, how he lured them, drugged them, strangled them, and dismembered their bodies. He spoke about his experiments with acid, his failed attempts to create zombies, and his grotesque desire to preserve parts of his victims as trophies. He explained how he photographed them at different stages of death, wanting to capture control and possession in images. What stunned detectives wasn't just what he had done, but the way he said it. There was no rage, no boasting, no real emotion at all. Dahmer spoke as if he were describing chores, a detached man recounting his private rituals. That eerie calmness haunted investigators, who realized they were listening to one of the darkest confessions in criminal history. News of his arrest spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the Milwaukee police station, shocked and horrified. For the families of his victims, the revelations were devastating. Many had spent years searching for missing sons and brothers, clinging to hope. Now they were faced with the gruesome truth that their loved ones had been taken in ways too horrifying to imagine. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began in January 1992, and it quickly became a national spectacle. Reporters from around the world filled the courtroom. The public wanted to understand. Who was this man? What drove him to such extremes? Was he evil, insane, or something even harder to explain? Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder, and unlike many killers who deny or manipulate, he pleaded guilty to all of them. His defense argued that he was legally insane, that no sane man could commit such crimes. His attorneys claimed his obsessions, his rituals, and his fantasies were proof of a mind broken beyond reason. The prosecution, however, argued that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing. He bought tools, used chemicals, hid evidence, and lied to escape suspicion. These were not the actions of a man unaware of reality, they said, but of someone fully conscious, fully responsible. Over weeks of testimony, psychiatrists debated Dahmer's state of mind. Was he insane or simply monstrous? The jury listened carefully while families of victims sat in anguish. When some of them gave victim impact statements, the courtroom erupted in raw emotion. One father shouted at Dahmer, demanding to know why. One sister screamed through tears, calling him the devil. The pain in that room was unbearable, but Dahmer sat quietly, barely reacting. In February 1992, the jury reached its verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences, nearly 1,000 years in prison. Justice, in some sense, had been delivered. But even in prison, Dahmer remained an unsettling figure. At Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, he was placed in protective custody at first. Other inmates despised him, not only for his crimes, but for the notoriety he brought. Over time, Dahmer developed a strange reputation behind bars. He sometimes mocked guards and inmates, making jokes about cannibalism, shaping his food into body parts, and pouring ketchup on it to mimic blood. Some saw this as a twisted sense of humor. Others saw it as a sign he was still taunting the world with his darkness. At the same time, Dahmer appeared to go through a transformation. He claimed to have found religion, was baptized by a prison minister, and began studying the Bible. To some, it seemed like genuine remorse. To others, it felt like another performance, one final mask. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer's story came to an end. He had been assigned to work cleaning a bathroom with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson, a convicted murderer, and Christopher Scarver, a man serving time for murder as well. Guards left them unsupervised. Minutes later, Scarver brutally attacked Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from exercise equipment. Dahmer was struck repeatedly in the head and face. By the time guards arrived, he was barely alive. He died shortly after at a nearby hospital. His death made headlines across the nation. For some, it felt like Justice the monster who had caused so much pain was gone. For others, it felt unsatisfying. Many families of victims wanted Dahmer to live, to face his guilt day after day, to suffer the weight of his actions in prison. But Scarver had ended that possibility. In the aftermath, the Oxford apartments, where Dahmer had committed his crimes, became a symbol of horror. People visited the building just to see the place where so many lives had ended. Eventually, in 1992, the city ordered it demolished, erasing the physical reminder of Dahmer's reign of terror. But memories cannot be demolished. Even today, Dahmer's name lingers in popular culture. Books, films, documentaries, and even TV series continue to revisit his crimes. People are drawn to the question, how could someone so ordinary-looking, so unremarkable, commit such evil? His story forces us to confront the unsettling idea that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they blend in, living next door, walking among us, hiding in plain sight. For the families of his victims, the legacy is not about fascination, but about pain. Their sons and brothers were not characters in a story, they were real people, loved and cherished, whose lives were stolen in unimaginable ways. Behind every headline, every documentary, lies their grief. And that is the chilling truth of Jeffrey Dahmer. His crimes weren't just about horror, they were about human lives, forever cut short. His story reminds us not only of evil's existence, but also of the cracks in society, the failures of justice, and the importance of listening to warnings before it's too late. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror ended in a prison bathroom, but the questions he left behind still haunt us. How many monsters are out there, smiling, hiding, waiting? And how do we truly recognize them before it's too late? And so, Jeffrey Dahmer's story does not end in the apartment where the horrors unfolded, nor in the courtroom where justice was sought. It ends behind prison walls, where another man, Christopher Scarver, took justice into his own hands in 1994. Dahmer was beaten to death in a correctional facility bathroom. For some, it was a final, fitting act. A man who had inflicted so much terror, meeting a brutal end himself. For others, it was yet another tragedy, a reminder that violence only ever begets more violence. But beyond the sensational headlines and chilling details, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to confront a darker question. How many red flags were missed? How many chances to save lives slipped through the cracks? And how many monsters walk among us today, unnoticed because no one dares to look closer? The letters, the testimonies, the photographs, they still haunt, not just because of the evil they represent, but because of what they say about us. about society, about the thin line between trust and danger, between neighbor and predator, Jeffrey Dahmer is gone. But the shadow of his crimes still lingers. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the boy next door.